Hi, Andrew Bosserman here. I'm a former IRS agent and tax controversy attorney with Boss Tax Law. And today we're going to dive into one of the most serious penalties in the federal tax code, and that is the civil fraud penalty, which you can find in Internal Revenue Code Section 6663. If you're a tax practitioner or a taxpayer facing potential fraud allegations, understanding the civil fraud penalty is critical. So let's break down what you need to know in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So first, what is the civil fraud penalty? The civil fraud penalty, which can be found in IRC Section 6663, it imposes an additional 75% on any portion of an underpayment of tax attributable to fraud. So unlike other accuracy-related penalties such as negligence, which are normally 20% or possibly 40%, this penalty reflects the IRS's most serious civil allegation against the taxpayer. So this penalty, the civil fraud penalty, applies only if a return is filed. If no return is filed, a different penalty, known as the fraudulent failure to file penalty, may apply instead. But in this video, I'm going to discuss the civil fraud penalty that applies when a return is filed. So just to illustrate more how devastating this penalty can be, let's work this out with some actual numbers in a hypothetical example. So imagine a taxpayer who fraudulently underreports their income, resulting in unpaid tax of $50,000. Here's how the penalties can compound. So first of all, they're going to owe the original tax due of $50,000, plus there would be that civil fraud penalty on top, which is 75% of $50,000. That's an additional $37,500. So we're already up to $87,500. Plus there's going to be some interest owed on top. So we're pushing $100,000 when it's all said and done. That's almost double the original tax liability. This example illustrates why it's critical to address fraud allegations immediately. And the civil fraud penalty is different from negligence. Negligence involves failure to make a reasonable attempt to comply with tax laws. Oftentimes, this is carelessness, inaccurate or inadequate record keeping, or failure to exercise reasonable or due care. Fraud, however, is different. It requires intentional wrongdoing with the specific purpose of evading a tax believed to be owed. So it's intentional. You must have taken specific steps. The distinction between negligence and civil fraud, it hinges on that intent. Negligence, which is carelessness, that doesn't rise to the level of civil fraud. But civil fraud, there has to be some intent, and the IRS has to be able to prove it. And this is where things get interesting from a litigation perspective. The IRS bears the burden of proving fraud by clear and convincing evidence. So there are different burdens of proof, but this is a higher standard than the usual preponderance of the evidence in most civil tax matters. So this means that the IRS must establish that there was an underpayment of tax and that some portion of the underpayment was due to fraud. And that must be proved, both of those things must be proved by clear and convincing evidence. So that's less than beyond a reasonable doubt, which that's the standard that applies in criminal proceedings. And that's essentially, you're almost absolutely positive that the individual committed the crime. But it is higher than preponderance of the evidence, which is just I'm 51% sure that something happened. Clear and convincing evidence is it's pretty likely that the individual intended to evade tax. That's pretty much how it would work. Like I mentioned, the initial burden is on the IRS to prove that a portion of the underpayment is attributable to fraud. But once the IRS meets this burden, you as the taxpayer can prove that some of the underpayment might not be attributable to fraud and that the 75% penalty shouldn't apply on portions of the underpayment. But to prove fraud, the IRS looks at what is known as badges of fraud. And badges of fraud are circumstantial evidence that suggests fraudulent intent. It's hard to prove fraud by direct evidence, observing the individual actually committing fraud or things like that, but it can be inferred from the taxpayer's conduct. I'm going to go through a quick list of common badges of fraud, but that would include consistent patterns of underreporting income, maintaining inadequate records, providing false explanations, concealing assets, dealing extensively in cash, filing false documents, failing to cooperate with tax authorities, engaging in illegal activities, using nominee accounts or shell companies, implausible or inconsistent explanations, filing false forms, W-2s, or other documentation. But as you see, the common thread between all of these is intent to evade tax. Normally, you're going to file some sort of false document, lie on your tax return, provide fake or doctored documentation to the IRS. No single factor in all of those is determinative, but the IRS is going to look at all of them and weigh them as a whole. It's not a checklist, and if you have more than 51%, then fraud is present. The IRS would weigh all of the factors in the light of the taxpayer's specific situations and what exactly has transpired. Statute of limitations is also extremely important in civil fraud because while most tax assessments have a 3-year statute of limitations for the IRS to assess additional tax, there is no statute of limitations in the case of fraud. So this means the IRS can assess taxes, penalties, and interest at any time if fraud is involved. And this unlimited assessment period makes fraud cases particularly dangerous for taxpayers. And oftentimes, if a taxpayer has been convicted criminally for tax fraud, the IRS will come after them for civil tax fraud. To add insult to injury, if a taxpayer is convicted of criminal tax fraud, they might have to go to prison, they might have to pay restitution, but on top of that, they're likely going to owe tax because, say in the case of embezzlement, if you steal money, that money is income to you and you should report it on your tax return. Now, most people who engage in embezzlement do not report the stolen income on their tax return. So the IRS comes after them after the criminal proceeding, says, oh, you have unreported income, and also a civil fraud penalty. If you have a situation like this, it's extremely important to consult with a tax controversy attorney to properly protect your rights and limit the tax and civil fraud penalty in those types of cases. It's also important to note that for joint returns, the fraud penalties does not apply to a spouse except to the intent that part of the underpayment is due to the fraud of that spouse. So generally, joint returns, each spouse can be held entirely liable for any tax owed, even if it's due to the other spouse. But this is an exception for fraud, whereas the other spouse generally is not held responsible for the fraud of the other spouse, except where there's evidence that the other spouse participated in the fraudulent activity or the spouse somehow furthered the fraud. Maybe they signed false documents, provide them to the IRS, things like that. It's also important to note that filing an amended return after filing a fraudulent return does not cure any fraud in the first return. The IRS can still pursue fraud with respect to the first return, and the taxpayer can't really cure or avoid the fraud penalty through fixing it later on. So this just means don't file a fraudulent tax return. And like I mentioned before, the civil fraud penalty is separate from criminal tax fraud prosecution. And also it's important to note that the Fifth Amendment may provide protection in criminal proceedings. That's the right to not incriminate yourself, but it really has limited applicability in civil cases. If you've gone through criminal prosecution, you definitely need to consult with a criminal defense attorney if you're in the process of that, or maybe an investigation is just getting started. But afterwards, you also need to consult with a civil tax controversy attorney because it's likely the IRS will come after you for unpaid tax and the civil fraud penalty. When I defend clients against fraud allegations, I focus on challenging the IRS's underpayment calculation, establishing good faith if possible, highlighting any sort of reliance on professionals, also proving any portion of the underpayment that's not due to fraud, and also show cooperation with authorities. It's hard to, in fraud cases, the IRS oftentimes has a very easy case, especially if there's a criminal conviction. But there are ways to challenge it and also limit the penalty by showing that not all of the underpayment was due to fraudulent activity. And that can save a lot of money in taxes and penalties. So, in conclusion, the civil fraud penalty represents the IRS's most serious civil enforcement tool for taxes. Understanding how to recognize potential fraud issues and properly defend against fraud allegations is essential for any tax practitioner, but also taxpayers who may have engaged in what the IRS would view as fraudulent activity. So if you're facing fraud allegations or concerned about potential exposure, you should consult as soon as possible with experienced counsel like myself to properly assess your risk and defend you if necessary. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like more information about the civil fraud penalty and how it may apply to your situation. But thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe, and I'll continue to put out more helpful tax controversy content like this.